This week we are going to look at chapter 10 and chapter 11 from our textbook. So I want to start with this as we're going over chapter 10 and 11. How could the United States become a more democratic, more prosperous, and more powerful, while at the same time becoming more unequal, more violent, and more divided? So we're going to look at the time period between 1820 and 1850 when Americans celebrated economic growth, urban expansion, and political participation. But during that same period, during the same 30 years, slavery expanded dramatically, Native peoples were displaced, families were torn apart in the domestic slave trade, and sectional tensions intensified. So this was not a simple era of progress. Instead, it was an era of transformation and contradiction. Today, we're going to explore how the market revolution, abolitionism, plantation expansion, and enslaved resistance were all deeply connected. So the first thing I want us to look at is the market revolution. By 1820, the American economy had changed very rapidly, and transportation improvements, we've looked at these already, but think about like the canals, roads, railroads, how all these connected local communities into a national market. Factories expanded in northern cities. Commercial farming replaced subsistence farming in many regions. So subsistence farming is just when you are only producing enough for your family, not enough to like sell elsewhere. So that changes. We now see that we are moving into commercial farming where we are producing so much that we have enough to sell and to make a living off of. And by 1850, most of the largest American cities are going to be in the north. Urban populations exploded, and immigrants, especially Irish and German immigrants, arrived in growing numbers. So we have what's called push and pull factors when we talk about immigration. So sometimes there are things happening in home countries that are pushing their residents out. And then also we have things happening in other countries that are pulling immigrants to us. So for instance, like in Ireland, there's the potato famine that happens. And potatoes were a staple Irish item in their diet. So a lot of people starved when the potato famine happened. That potato famine is a factor that is pushing people out of Ireland. A pull factor would be we are the land of opportunity. At least that's how we sold ourselves. There is enough land for everyone to go around. You can come here, you can start over, you can be fresh, and you can become rich. You can become a landowner. That is a pull factor. We are pulling people to the U.S. So by 1850, Irish immigrants made up nearly 40% of all immigrants to the United States because of that potato famine. And what we see is that cities offered jobs, and jobs fueled economic growth. But urban life also created a lot of instability. Competition for work intensified, and we see a lot of violence breaking out between Irish immigrants and free Black workers. There's also fear of crime that's going to increase. Police departments were created in response to this, and the market revolution created opportunity, but also it created disorder. And as cities grew, a new middle class emerged, and this middle class identified itself through education, religious respectability, and adherence to the idea of separate spheres. Men were expected to participate in the public world of work and politics. Women were seen as moral guardians of the home. But middle class women also shaped consumer culture and reform movements. And economic growth was reshaping society in ways both empowering and restrictive. I'm sorry, I didn't scroll down so that you guys could see all this. There's also a really great older movie now. It's called The Gangs of New York. And if you watch Gangs of New York, it is long. Daniel Day-Lewis, Cameron Diaz, and Leonardo DiCaprio are all in it. But it does show, if you kind of look at it, it shows like this ethnic background. It shows like the rise of political bosses, the rise of crime, how police are influenced. And it's all set in like the 1800s. And I want to say it's set before the Civil War. I'm not sure exactly the decade, but you guys watch it and you can tell me what decade it's set in. But it's good. It kind of gives you an eye into what is happening during this time period. Let's look at abolitionism and how it expands and divides. So at the same time that the economy was transforming, reform movements were also expanding. And one of the most controversial was abolitionism, right? The ending of slavery. Early voices like David Walker demanded immediate emancipation, and rejected gradual compromise. So David Walker, he writes his appeal. You can look that up. It's a much longer title than that. But David Walker, he is a Black man. And that's important to note because the next guy, William Lloyd Garrison, is a white man. And he published The Liberator and called slavery a moral evil that must end immediately. Then you also have groups of people. You don't just have individuals, but you have societies that are forming. Like this one in 1833, the American Anti-Slavery Society formed. And we see Black and white reformers working together. Formerly enslaved speakers like the great Frederick Douglass provided powerful testimony about the brutality of slavery, but abolition is going to divide the nation. Some Northerners oppose slavery's expansion, right? They don't want slavery to expand anymore, but they don't support racial equality. Violence also erupted against abolitionists in some northern cities. So what we see is that Congress ends up passing this gag rule. And here's a little political cartoon for you about the gag rule. And we don't even, like, they block anti-slavery petitions. They don't even want to talk about slavery in Congress anymore. You also have churches start to split over slavery. One of the greatest examples I have of this, and I think your book talks about this too, are the Quakers. The Quaker faith, when they first established themselves in the colonies, they do have slaves. Over time, though, Quakers get rid of slaves, and even to remain a member of the Quaker faith, to remain a member of that church, you had to free all of your slaves. Slavery wasn't allowed anymore. Also, Quakers open up like the first school for Blacks. So Quakers go, like, they jump ship and they go all in when they talk about ending slavery within their own faith. So, but we do see churches splitting over slavery. And even within the abolitionist movement, divisions emerge over strategies in women's participation. So we have the women's movement begins in 1848 in Seneca Falls, New York. And you have these women there. You have women like Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. They're denied full participation at an international anti-slavery convention. So what they do is they organize the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. And they start to fight, that fight against slavery. It helped spark the women's rights movement. And reform movements were reshaping political activism, but they were also exposing all these deep fault lines in American society. And one of those is going to be about women and how women are treated. But we're going to come back to that. We do talk more about like women and women's rights when we get into the second part of History 104. We talk more about it because it's kind of put on pause. It's not kind of, it is put on pause because all we focus on is the ending of slavery and we push women to the back burner for this time period. But let's talk about planters expanding the slave system, and this is from chapter 11. So while abolitionists demanded slavery's end, Southern planters were expanding it. And the cotton gin and global demand for cotton made slavery extremely profitable. Planters moved west into Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and the newly acquired Texas. And this is really important when we look at the, like Texas gets their independence, then Texas is going to be annexed by the United States, and then that annexation, there's a border dispute that will lead to the Mexican-American War, and that happens in 1848. And we will briefly discuss that. But if you really want to know more about Mexican history and the influence of Mexico in American Southwest, I suggest taking a different class because we just don't have time in the short amount of weeks that we have in this class. But do know that because of the war with Mexico that ends in 1848 and it ends with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, we have now gained all this land. What do we do with this land? Is this land going to be slave or is it going to be free? Because under Mexican law, slavery had been abolished. Slavery is not going to be abolished when that territory is gained. And that's important to know. So during this time period, though, we do see the domestic slave trade growing dramatically. Enslaved families are going to be separated. People were sold south and west in massive numbers. Though wealthy plantation owners dominated Southern politics, most enslavers owned only a few enslaved people. So only about 5% of the white population in the South actually owned slaves. But when you think about it, that's a very small number of people owning other people. But think about how many people they must have owned, because we have hundreds of thousands of slaves in the South. So Southern society becomes more tightly bound to slavery, and that plantation elite, that 5%, controlled all the political power in the South. And planters increasingly defended slavery as a positive good, not just as necessary evil. And then the expansion of slavery reshaped the entire Southern economy, and it also is going to influence national politics. This was not a positive good. This was not good for anybody. The only people that it was good for were the white people who were getting rich off of the black people. So it's important to understand that slavery was not only a Southern system. Northern textile factories also depended on Southern cotton, and Northern banks financed plantation expansion in the South. Shipping and insurance industries profited from slave produced goods, and slavery was national. Within plantations, enslaved labor took different forms, right? So some worked in gang labor systems under constant supervision, and others worked under a task system. And you're going to learn more about those as you read through the chapters. Both systems were physically demanding and tightly controlled, but enslaved people were not passive victims. They built families. They created syncretic religious traditions, blending African and Christian practices. They used natural medicine. They formed bonds of community and resistance. And we see a lot of African culture still in the South within African American society today. And resistance took on many forms, right? It wasn't just these all-out rebellions. Subtle resistance included breaking tools, working slowly, sabotaging the equipment, running away, but resistance also became overt, and we have examples of that, and one of those is in 1831, Nat Turner led a rebellion in Virginia. More than 50 enslaved people were temporarily liberated, 57 whites were killed, Turner and many others were executed, and white mobs attacked African Americans who had no connection to the rebellion at all. Then in 1839, enslaved Africans aboard the Spanish ship Amistad revolted, and eventually the Supreme Court ruled in their favor because we had outlawed international slave trade, and these slaves were coming from outside of our borders. So these acts of resistance terrified slaveholders, and they led to stricter slave codes and harsher enforcements. So just really quickly, I do want to discuss the Mexican-American War. As slavery expanded westward, so did our borders, right? We fought the war between 1846 and 48, and resulted in all of the Southwest. These new lands reopened the most explosive question of the era: would slavery expand into the West? And every new territory forced Congress to confront that issue. Expansion was no longer just about land. It was about the future balance of power. So between 1820 and 1850, what we see are cities growing, reform movements growing and gaining momentum, slavery intensified, resistance persisted, and sectional tensions deepened. And the United States was growing richer and more powerful, but it was not growing more united. And these contradictions of the era would soon push the nation towards crisis. And understanding these contradictions, it really helps us understand why compromise became increasingly impossible.